Hi, I'm Debbie Watrous, Executive Director of the New Hampshire Humanities Council. Welcome to Human Ties, the program about the humanities from the Humanities Council, a program in which we feature some of the fascinating people and programs taking place around the state that connect you with your history, literature, ideas, past, and a way to think about the future. And I'm very pleased today to have as my guest Glenn Knoblock, who is an author and historian who focuses on a couple of very interesting topics. And today we're primarily going to focus on cemeteries and graveyards, gravestones in New Hampshire. And Glenn, I'm so glad you could join us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And let me tell you a little bit about Glenn. As I said, he is a historian and author of a number of books about both about cemeteries and about African American military heroes. Some of his titles are Historic Burial Grounds of the New Hampshire Seacoast, New Hampshire Covered Bridges, Strong and Brave Fellows, New Hampshire Black Soldiers and Sailors of the American Revolution, 1775 to 1784, Brewing in New Hampshire, oh, let's talk about brewing, Black Submariners of the United States Navy, 1940 to 1975, Portsmouth Cemeteries, and cemeteries around Lake Winnipesaukee. And we know Glenn at the Humanities Council because he travels around the state under our auspices through our Humanities to Go Speakers Bureau. And so local communities invite Glenn to come to their town, often to their local cemetery, and talk about the history of their cemetery or the history of cemeteries more generally. Glenn also serves as an advisory member on the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Cemetery Committee in Portsmouth and has been featured on New Hampshire Chronicle, New Hampshire Public Radio, and now here on Public Access TV in Manchester. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you.
So what got you interested in studying cemeteries and gravestones?
Well, when I first moved out here, of course, just started looking around and seeing all the historic sites I could see with my history degree. I've always, of course, had an eye toward history, but the old cemeteries were really caught my eye, and so I started going into as many as I could just on my off hours, and might be traveling along a road and see one and kind of stop the car and check and see what was there. And so I became very fascinated by them, and then that just kind of naturally progressed. I wanted to see what was written about the cemeteries, both the people that are buried within them and also the markers themselves, you know, who had created these markers. And I really found that, especially for New Hampshire, there was a great need for some work to be done in the area. There wasn't a lot written about New Hampshire cemeteries. Of course, there's quite a bit written about some of the more famous cemeteries in places like Boston and Philadelphia, but not too much in New Hampshire. So I was able to start doing a little digging on my own, so to speak, and find out some fascinating information.
So talk a bit about what you learn when you look at a gravestone. What are sort of some of the elements you're looking at, and what can a gravestone tell you beyond the name of the deceased, their birth date, their death date, sometimes a spouse? What else do you learn?
Well, there's a number of different things that I look at. Obviously, the first thing is the iconography on the stone itself. Do they have the winged skull, death's head? Do they have an angel or soul effigy, if you will? Some of the creative aspects of the stone can often give us a clue as to the religious ideals of the people of a particular area or a colony. And also, again, not only the names and dates on there, but also some of the fascinating inscriptions on there. It's interesting, in the colonial times, we get much more in terms of a person's background, whether they're wealthy or not, perhaps what their trade was. So there's many different things that are revealed on them that, compared to today's monuments, that are rather plain compared to colonial times.
I was thinking that, having looked at some of the colonial gravestones, is thinking, you know, as you said, the winged skull, and some of the humorous inscriptions, and then some of the terrifying ones, those moralistic, you know, here too shall thou go. And talk a bit about, is this particularly in colonial times that you see some of this?
Yes, you really do see those in colonial times. So if we think of them in the spirit of the times when these monuments were created, they were kind of an adjunct to the preaching that was done on the Sabbath day. Of course, if you were a good churchgoer, as many New Englanders were, you'd go to church all day on the Sabbath. And then the fiery hell and brimstone type sermons that you would hear, especially the ideals back then were man's mortality and where one would end up in the afterlife. Only a few might be chosen. The chosen few would go to heaven. All the rest may go to other places. So a lot of these ideals are reinforced on the gravestones themselves. Not everyone could read the Bible, but they could all understand the visual images in the local cemeteries. And we have to remember the cemeteries back in the colonial times were often in the center of town. That was the norm, not the exception. It's only later on where they start to move out of town as land use becomes more constricted and health concerns come into play. So the cemeteries are right in the center of town. People often use them to walk through, almost picnic areas, if you will. So they were used quite differently in the colonial days than they are today.
What are some of the messages that you can get about a period of time or important events that are happening that you can read on a gravestone?
For example, in some of the Portsmouth gravestones, they talk about someone dying amidst ye noise and rage of the American Revolution. So it bespeaks, that type of wording bespeaks to us the uncertainty, the hesitancy of these troubled times. And indeed, the American Revolution, especially in the early years, were very troubled times. Here you're rebelling against a king, the king that you've known all your life, and so it's uncertain. Were the colonies going to win? So that's one aspect that you see often on Revolutionary War gravestones, the wording, laid to rest amidst ye noise and rage of war, those types of things. Other things you can tell just by the dates or the time frame, or sometimes an epitaph, perhaps an epidemic that has struck a particular area.
What do you see around here in the epidemic?
Well, actually, for the kind of the seacoast and central part of New Hampshire, you see the great throat distemper epidemic of 1735 that really struck very hard and almost appeared as if it would be the end of the world. So in places like Kingston, East Kingston, Exeter, Hampton Falls, really all the way up and down the seacoast, we see these large number of gravestones for children, and also just some of the very tearful epitaphs that are upon those stones. And so it really bespeaks to this great tragedy that befell the area. Few people know that this epidemic was of such massive proportions. Many of the children in these small towns were almost entirely carried off, and the epidemic ranged all the way into Maine and all the way south, stopping just short of Boston. But really there were many sermons preached as if a great sin had been committed and as if it might be the end of the world. So it was a very terrifying times, and again the gravestones kind of demonstrate that, as if the number of them alone weren't enough.
Right.
So,
right. What do you remember? Can you quote any humorous epitaphs that particularly stand out?
I can't really think of anything particularly humorous, but in the typical New England fashion, you'll see some very interesting ones. There's one up in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, that says "killed by the fall of a tree." Just simple wording, no lament, just how he died, very matter of fact. There's another one in Portsmouth that has at the top, it's one of the pictures in our program, I believe, it says nipped in the bud. So again, just some interesting epitaphs like that. There are certainly many humorous ones. Those tend to come a little bit later than colonial times. But you can find all manner of inscriptions that really give some insight into a person's background or a person's death or their character. One of my favorites in Portsmouth talks about a young child that died 11 or 12 years old in memory of a sacred and dutiful child. The emphasis, I believe, on dutiful. They did what they were supposed to. As all children should, of course.
Right. Both a moral for
yes.
for those left behind. Talk a bit about the iconography, about the graphic images that
Sure.
are there.
Well, it really goes in phases. If we understand that most of the gravestones that were produced came from the Boston area and to a lesser extent the Newport, Rhode Island area in the beginning. Those were the urban centers. And because those are, Boston is a Massachusetts Bay colony following the Puritan ideals. So the images that they created were following the Puritan teachings. So that's why we see the winged skull, or death's head, if you will, a dual motif, the skull signifying the mortality that everyone has in store for them, but also the wings attached to it, kind of signifying that everyone's possible ascension to heaven. And then there are other icons that go with those. The winged hourglass, for example. Again, the ideal that time is fleeting for all of us. And then some of the more graphic implements, the pickaxe and spade, the tools of the gravedigger and burial shrouds and things like that. So we start off with these stark images of death, but over the years they kind of gradually soften, starting after the 1740s with the Great Awakening period, where kind of the religious teaching soften up a bit, so to speak. We start to see the angelic figures come aboard, so a little bit more hopeful images of death. And so that becomes very positive and seemingly more applicable for children as well. It's always been fantastic to me that these stark images of death on children's gravestones are rather striking. But again, in the spirit of the times, they were perfectly acceptable. And then from the angels, or they're often referred to as soul effigies, we go to the willow and the urn, and they start to become popular in the 1790s, and they're really the first what I would call fashionable gravestone design. We think of the weeping willow today as a traditional mourning symbol, and so it has been seen. The urns, though, are kind of inspired by some of the discoveries in Egypt and Middle Eastern lands where such urns as those were used in funerary practices. Obviously, we didn't have cremation at the time here, so those were just more fashionable items that appeared on gravestones. And really, the willow tree and the urn then become very dominant and kind of push out the other icons, so to speak, and really persist well through the 1800s and even into the early years of the last century. It is interesting, though, even though the winged skull kind of dies out in popularity, it is revived at times, like during the American Revolution, where, again, things are a little more despairing, so we revert back to the less hopeful images.
Were there carvers that were famous or well-known and imitated? Yeah,
there were quite a few carvers, and they can really be divided into two schools. The urban area carvers would be carvers from Boston, Massachusetts, Newport, Rhode Island, and there were those that copied them. And there were a number of families in Boston. The Lamsons of Charlestown started very early on. One of the earliest gravestone cutters that we don't know his name. He's referred to in the records as the old carver of Boston. We don't know much about him, but his work is very prevalent early on, from about the 1650s through the 1670s or 80s. The Foster family, several generations out of Dorchester, Massachusetts. So those are some of the major ones. New Hampshire, interestingly, does not have their own native stone carver really until the 1770s. Again, the New Hampshire seacoast is rather maritime-minded, if you will, and they could simply travel down to Boston and order their gravestones down there, and easily transport them back. They didn't need a native stone carver. But as the area grew and more demand came about, they eventually evolved, although New Hampshire really, until after the 1800s, did not have that many stone cutters. There was no need for them.
I'm curious, we've been talking about individual gravestones, and you mentioned briefly how cemeteries, their location in town has changed, and I'm curious to have you talk a bit about how cemeteries tell us something about a community. And I think about things like class consciousness, who gets positioned where within a cemetery, where a cemetery is placed in a town. when you have private cemeteries versus public ones. Maybe you could talk a bit about some of that.
Cemeteries do tell us a lot about a locale. If we look at their location in particular, along the seacoast in the beginning, following the English pattern, most of them were beside a church or a meeting house, more proper. But as the New Hampshire settlements expanded and moved westward and northward toward the Lakes region, religion kind of dies out as the primary function. A lot of times public cemeteries aren't established until, say, 10, 20 years after a settlement is commenced. In that case, the dead are buried on private land and private cemeteries or in small, like, neighborhood cemeteries. So here we have groups of families. And those are kind of interesting because now in some areas you can find these rural cemeteries that are seemingly out in the middle of nowhere, but they're really a sign that once upon a time there was a community there that was thriving and very active. I'll give you an example. In North Wolfboro, around a place called Diamond's Corner, there's a rather large neighborhood cemetery there. Right as of now, it's on a dirt road. It's out literally in the middle of the woods, and you would wonder how that ended up there. But Diamond's Corner really was the original center of Wolfboro activities in its early founding in the 1760s, 1780s, and eventually the area grows and the population center shifts closer towards the lake area, Wolfboro Bay. So that cemetery becomes not abandoned, but it's not used as frequently. So again, that kind of tells us. Now within the cemetery, there's all sorts of interesting things that we can see. The size of a gravestone really is very important. Gravestones are commodities that are purchased. The bigger the gravestone, the more expensive it is. So it's natural.
But nothing has changed there.
Nothing has changed there, right. The bigger the car, the more expensive it is. So they're really status symbols. And so if you were to look at a cemetery overall and you wanted to step back and say, all right, who's the most wealthy person in the cemetery, you could probably just go to the largest gravestone and say, all right, that's the most wealthy and or prominent individuals. So oftentimes we'll see church deacons or business leaders or military militia leaders, those types of, and obviously founding fathers of a particular town or whatever. Again, that doesn't always hold up true. In cemeteries, you can't. There's no tried and true formula. John Langdon's tomb in Portsmouth North Cemetery looks rather nondescript today, but so there are exceptions to that rule, but the larger ones, the more ornate, the more expensively carved, certainly indicate economic wealth and those types of things. Mm-hmm. Also, generally closer to if it's a meeting house cemetery, the closer to the side of the church, generally, the more prominent in town. Not necessarily the most wealthy, but more prominent. Perhaps in our day we might say pious. And again, that kind of follows the Old English traditions, say like Westminster Cathedral, where prominent individuals were buried inside the church. And we actually have a few examples of that, where that happened in Portsmouth.
Oh, really?
One of the prominent pastors of Portsmouth South Church was actually buried under the pulpit. His remains were later removed when that church was torn down. That was, the exception, not the rule in New Hampshire colonies, but it did occur. So some people had prominent burial spots already marked as close to the church as they could. And conversely, those that are outside society or lesser members of society are buried further away, perhaps in a back corner of the church. That might be someone who's indigent. Maybe the church paid for their burial. Or it could be someone who had committed a crime, perhaps someone that was executed for a crime, and probably not buried with a headstone, might have been buried outside the cemetery boundaries. And sadly enough, African Americans were often viewed as second-class citizens and were buried outside or in the far corner of the cemetery walls. There's one example in Gilmanton where an African-American veteran of the Civil War, Moses Dustin, is buried outside the cemetery on a corner kind of right along the edge of the woods. He deserved better than that, but in the times that was acceptable.
Is there a headstone for him?
There is a headstone. I believe it's more modern and probably was placed rather recently, perhaps mid-century or something. But the fact the folklore in Gilmanton was that his presence in town, Moses Dustin, was not really appreciated. No doubt because of he was African American. Mm-hmm. So.
Well, this is just so fascinating, and I want to mention that you'll be talking this month, July 30th, at the Bethlehem Heritage Society, yeah. August 9th at the New Durham Public Library, which is also hosted by the New Durham Historical Society, yeah. and then August 14th at the Holderness Historical Society. And all of these and any other future programs that you do through our Humanities to Go program, you can go to our website at nhhc.org and see our calendar of events there and find listings. We do it by region, we do it chronologically, so you can find out when some of these programs are going to take place. If you are part of an organization that would like to bring Glenn to do a talk, you can also apply for his talk through our Humanities to Go program. What the New Hampshire Humanities Council does is we pay for Glenn to go do the talk. We pay a portion of his mileage. You pick up the rest of the mileage tab and help to promote it locally. We promote it statewide through our calendar and our e-newsletter. And it's a great way to bring this fascinating program to your local community without having to find Glenn to create the program. It's already created for you.
Yeah, one thing I would like to say is that I really do try to tailor my programs. It's not a canned lecture, so to speak. I really do try to tailor it to each individual town. I'll give you an example. We just did an event in Francistown. Toward the end of June, we turned it into an outdoor tour of the cemetery. We incorporated demonstrations on giving gravestone rubbings. We had free pizza and ice cream for the kids, and really we had a nice turnout. More importantly, we had a wide segment of the community in Francistown. They really did a wonderful job organizing that, and had a lot of children there who I typically don't see at these types of lectures, but there's no reason they can't attend. So there's lots of wonderful things that we can do out there.
One of the things that you and I were talking about before we started the show was that these talks are not only interesting just to get a sense of a community's history or kind of the role of cemeteries and gravestones in our past, but it also is a way to call attention to the preservation needs of our cemeteries. And one of the things we were talking about were the public issues around use of cemeteries, things like public access and grave rubbings, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's kind of a dichotomy there. I think the best scenario is we would like the public cemeteries to be open. And again, if we kind of revert back to the old colonial times where people spent time in the cemeteries, perhaps in reflection or whether it's a picnic lunch or whatever, there's certainly many beautiful spots that can be done. And along with that, if you're into gravestone rubbing and things like that, certain communities do have restrictions on that. Portsmouth is considering those at this time. My point of view is if there's no danger, I don't believe we should prohibit rubbings. In some cases, you kind of have to. But the idea is the more these sites are studied, viewed, used, if you will, the more accessible they are, the more we can not only understand them, but we kind of bring them into the community and really let people understand what they have. I use the term that many of these cemeteries are open-air museums, if you will. I didn't coin that phrase, but it really is very apt for this situation. And a lot of towns have just wonderful old cemeteries, but they may not know what they have. I just think these cemeteries are quintessential New England archaeological sites, if you will, and to really understand New England, there's not a lot of, comparatively speaking, not a lot of old houses you can go into that aren't unchanged or in some form, or old churches, but you can go into these places and really get a sense of New England, if you will.
So, do you have a new book project? Are you working on something right now, or an article?
Well, I'm my main concentration right now is I've been working on some African American related material. I am contemplating a book on cemeteries in the White Mountains area, so I think that'll come on down the road. I've also have possibly in the work something for southern New Hampshire. So we've got a whole rest of the state to do. I've done the seacoast, the lakes region, and Portsmouth in particular. But there's some other areas, time allowing, that I really would like to cover that has some fascinating stories to tell. So.
Well, and I'm going to definitely have you back because I do want you to come back and talk about your other particular field of interest, which is African American military figures. And that is certainly a piece of our history that we're really just beginning to get to know.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. And like I said, that's really has been my focus as of late. So love to come back and talk to you about that.
You are going to be again on July 30th at the Bethlehem Heritage Society, August 9th at the New Durham Public Library, and August 14th at the Holderness Historical Society. And all of this information, plus other talks that you're doing in the future and other programs, all free and open to the public, are available at the Humanities Council website. You see it on the screen there, nhhc.org. You can also give our office a call at 224-4071. We have a printed calendar of events, which we send out every month. It's 12 to 16 pages long, chock full of free public programs taking place all over the state. And we would love to have you get that calendar or get our e-calendar, which we send out by email, save some postage, save some printing costs, save some trees, but give you a chance to know what programs are happening in your area. And it's a great way to connect to the history of this state, to the great literature and great thought down through the ages, and have wonderful conversations with your neighbors. So please join us, and join us again for Human Ties, again, the program from the New Hampshire Humanities Council. I'm Debbie Watrous. Thank you for joining us.